Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we are tackling, well, really one of the most relevant concepts in health, I think, stress and adaptation.
Absolutely. It's everywhere.
It is, and it's not
Mhm.
just, a feeling, it's physiology. It affects every single cell in your body.
Mm-hmm.
Our sources, especially Porth's chapter on this, give us some pretty staggering insights. Uh, think about the 2017 APA survey that showed 80% of Americans reporting at least one symptom: headaches, anxiety.
Yeah, the list goes on.
Right. And interestingly, 57% specifically pointed to the political climate as a major stressor. So our mission today is to kind of cut through that noise. We want to guide you through the core pathophysiology, what's actually happening inside when you feel stressed. We use a clear roadmap from the source.
And to really get that, you have to look back a bit at the history. Walter Cannon, back in the early 1900s, he formalized this idea of homeostasis.
Right, stability.
Purposeful stability, yes, resisting disturbances. And he also gave us that famous term fight or flight for the rapid response. Then, building on Cannon's work, you have Hans Selye. He defined stress more formally as an orchestrated set of bodily responses. He saw it wasn't just one reaction, but a whole system kicking in, a coordinated reaction to demanding stimuli.
So it's fundamentally about survival then.
Exactly. That historical context is key. It's a survival mechanism at its core. Hashtag the foundation of constancy, homeostasis.
Okay, so let's start with that baseline, homeostasis. We hear the word all the time, but maybe we don't always grasp the specifics. It's active, right? Not just passive stability.
Precisely. It's purposeful maintenance of a stable internal environment. The idea actually goes back even further to Claude Bernard. He talked about the milieu intérieur.
The internal environment.
Yeah, basically the stable fluid around our cells. Think of it like the thermostat and climate control in your house. It keeps conditions optimal for the occupants, the cells. If that internal climate goes haywire, life's in danger.
And keeping it stable involves thousands of these physiological control systems. The source material really breaks them down nicely into three essential parts.
Yes, you absolutely need these three components. Always. First, a sensor. Something has to detect the change.
Like the hiker seeing a snake example. The eyes are the sensor.
Exactly. Your eyes see the snake. Second, you need an integrator or comparator, often in the brain or spinal cord. It takes the sensor data, compares it to the internal set point, the normal range, and decides if action is needed. Is this snake a threat?
Okay, makes sense.
And third, you need an effector. This is the muscle or gland or tissue that actually carries out the response to reverse the change. For the hiker, that's activating the heart, the lungs, the leg muscles to get away fast.
Got it. Sensor, integrator, effector. And the mechanism that makes it all work to maintain stability is mostly negative feedback.
Overwhelmingly, yes. Negative feedback is the primary driver. It works just like your home thermostat. When the temperature deviates, the system kicks in to bring it back the other way. It opposes the initial change.
Can you give us a clear example?
Sure. Blood glucose is the classic one. You eat, glucose goes up, sensors detect it, the integrator and the pancreas signals for insulin release. Insulin is the effector. It helps cells take up glucose, lowering blood levels.
And if it drops too low?
The system flips. Insulin release is inhibited. Other hormones, like glucagon, are released from the liver to bring glucose levels back up. It's this constant push and pull, always aiming for that stable set point. Hashtag the General Adaptation Syndrome, Selye's model.
Okay, so negative feedback keeps things stable under normal fluctuations.
Yeah.
But what happens when the stressor is huge, like really overwhelming? Does the body just give up on stability?
Not give up, but shift priorities dramatically. That's where Selye's General Adaptation Syndrome, the GAS, comes into play. He described it as general because it's a systemic reaction, adaptive because it's a response to the stressor, and a syndrome because it's a coordinated set of signs.
And he first noticed this in animals, right, with some specific physical changes.
Yes. His early work with rats under severe stress showed this consistent triad: adrenal enlargement, thymic atrophy, shrinkage of a thymus gland, important for immunity, and gastric ulcers.
But, worrying about a deadline or the news doesn't immediately make your adrenals bigger.
Yeah.
How does Selye's model, based on pretty extreme physical stress, apply to our modern psychological stressors?
That's a great question. It applies because the mechanism is the same, even if the trigger is different and the intensity varies. Selye's triad showed the physical endpoint of acute, overwhelming stress. When modern psychological stress becomes chronic, it pushes the same systems towards that same point of damage, just maybe more slowly. The stages he identified still hold.
Okay, so what are the stages?
Stage 1 is the alarm stage. This is pure fight or flight. The sympathetic nervous system, SNS, and the HPA axis are instantly activated. You get that flood of adrenaline, noradrenaline, and cortisol, that jolt. Right. Then, if the stressor persists, you move into the resistance stage. The body sort of calms down the initial panic. It selects the most effective, most economic defenses. Cortisol levels might even drop a bit as the body tries to conserve resources while still dealing with the threat.
But this can't go on forever.
No. If the stressor is severe, long-lasting, and feels uncontrollable, you hit the exhaustion stage. Resources are depleted. The adaptive mechanisms fail. You see that wear and tear. This is where Selye linked stress to diseases like ulcers and heart problems. It's the cost of chronic activation.
It's crucial, though, as the source points out, that not all stress is bad stress, right? There's a difference.
Absolutely. Selye himself distinguished between eustress, which is mild, brief, controllable stress we perceive positively, like learning something new or exercising in distress. Distress is the severe, prolonged, uncontrolled kind that's disruptive and harmful. Hashtag the pathophysiology of the stress response.
Okay, let's get into the nitty-gritty wiring. How does the brain actually coordinate this whole massive response?
Well, the central nervous system is key. You've got input from the cerebral cortex for vigilance, the limbic system handling emotions, the thalamus relaying signals, the RAS keeping you alert, but the real coordinator, that's the hypothalamus.
And it sends signals out through specific pathways.
Exactly. Two major neuroendocrine axes manage the response. First, the superfast one, the Locus Coeruleus-NE system. The LSE, deep in the brainstem, is packed with norepinephrine-producing neurons. It's the main hub for the autonomic nervous system's immediate reaction.
So that's the instant alertness, pounding heart, pupils dilating, gut shutting down.
Precisely. That's the LCNE system firing on all cylinders, almost instantaneous.
And the other axis? Slower.
Slower, yes, because it relies on hormones traveling through the blood. That's the CRF-ACTH cortisol axis, usually just called the HPA axis.
HPA for hypothalamus pituitary adrenal.
Correct. The hypothalamus releases corticotropin releasing factor, or CRF. CRF tells the anterior pituitary gland to release adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH. And ACTH travels down to the adrenal cortex, sitting on top of the kidneys, and tells it to release cortisol.
Cortisol, the main stress hormone. What exactly does it do? It sounds like it does a lot.
It really does. It's fascinating because it's both a mediator and an inhibitor. It mediates by making sure you have enough energy. It raises blood glucose, often by working against insulin. It also makes your tissues more sensitive to those fast catecholamines like norepinephrine.
But it also inhibits things. How does that work with negative feedback?
Right. High levels of cortisol signal back to the hypothalamus and pituitary to say, okay, we've got enough, you can slow down production. That's the negative feedback loop. But its inhibitory actions on other body systems are where chronic stress gets problematic.
Like what? What are the key things it suppresses?
Critically, chronically high cortisol suppresses the immune system. That's partly why people often get sick after major It suppresses reproductive hormones, which can impact fertility, and it inhibits bone formation and growth factors.
Wow, so it's really redirecting all resources to immediate survival, even at the expense of long-term health systems.
That's a perfect way to put it.
And there are other hormones involved too, mentioned in the chapter. Aldosterone, ADH.
Yes, they play important supporting roles. Aldosterone, another adrenal hormone, makes the kidneys hang on to sodium, which helps keep blood pressure and volume up.
Useful in, say, bleeding.
Exactly. And antidiuretic hormone, ADH, also called vasopressin, released from the posterior pituitary, does two main things. It makes the kidneys conserve water, again helping blood volume, and it's a potent vasoconstrictor, squeezing blood vessels to raise pressure. It also works with CRF to boost ACTH release, especially if blood pressure is dangerously low.
So when all these changes, hormones, heart rate, immune suppression become chronic, we're not really in homeostasis anymore. The book introduces this term allostasis. How is that different?
Good distinction. Allostasis refers to the process of achieving stability through change. It's the body actively adjusting its internal set points and operating parameters, the neuroendocrine, autonomic, immune systems, to cope with a perceived challenge or demand. It's adaptation in action.
Okay, so allostasis is the active adaptation. What's allostatic load?
Allostatic load is the cumulative cost, the wear and tear that results from prolonged or repeated allostasis. It's the price the body pays for constantly having to adapt, for operating outside its normal homeostatic range for too long. Think of it as the system getting overloaded.
And that overload seems tightly linked to the immune system. The chapter talks about PNEI, psychoneuroimmunology. It's not just stress hormones affecting immunity, but immunity affecting the stress response too.
It's absolutely a two-way street. We know cortisol suppresses immune function, but immune cells themselves release signaling molecules called cytokines, things like interleukin-1, TNF-alpha. These cytokines can actually signal the brain, activating the HPA axis and potentially prolonging the stress response. It can even change the type of immune response the body mounts. It's a constant dialogue. Hashtag adaptation and modifying factors.
So if adaptation is the goal, getting back to balance, and coping mechanisms are the things we do to manage threats,
Yeah.
why the huge variation? Why do some people seem to handle immense pressure while others crumble under much less?
Yeah, that variability is huge. It really boils down to several modifying factors, as outlined in the text. One big one is physiologic and anatomic reserve.
Meaning, like, how much buffer the body has.
Exactly. Anatomic reserve is having paired organs like kidneys. You usually don't see signs of failure until you've lost a lot of function, maybe 80%. Physiologic reserve is the functional capacity of systems. Think about blood loss. Lose a little bit gradually, the body compensates, adapts. Lose a lot suddenly, that's shock. The system is overwhelmed. Reserve matters.
And time, you mentioned. Gradual change is easier to adapt to.
Definitely. Time is critical. Gradual onset allows adaptive mechanisms to kick in more effectively.
What about factors inherent to the person, like age?
Age is a big one. Adaptive capacity is generally lower at the extremes of life. Infants have immature systems, and the elderly often have declining function and less reserve.
Genetics too, presumably.
Genetics certainly plays a role in determining the flexibility and efficiency of our stress response systems. And gender differences exist too. The source notes that premenopausal women often show less intense sympathetic activation to certain stressors compared to men. This might influence disease patterns.
Makes sense. And then there were the more changeable factors, like health.
Absolutely. Your overall health status is key. Chronic illness obviously depletes resources. Nutrition is vital. Both deficiency and excess, like obesity or alcohol abuse, impair adaptation. Sleep is incredibly important too. Disrupting those natural circadian rhythms throws the whole system off.
And finally, the psychological side. The book mentions hardiness.
Yes, hardiness. This is a personality trait characterized by sort of a sense of control, commitment, or purpose, and viewing stressors as challenges rather than overwhelming threats. Hardy individuals tend to cope better. And of course, psychosocial factors like strong social support act as a significant buffer against the negative impacts of stress. Hashtag tag disorders and treatment of chronic stress.
Okay, so the stress response is designed for acute threats, short-term survival. When it stays switched on chronically, it becomes the problem itself. What's the clearest example of this going wrong?
The textbook example really is post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD. It's a truly disabling condition that arises after experiencing or witnessing severe trauma, war, assault, major disasters. It's characterized by the chronic activation of that stress response system.
And the diagnosis requires symptoms for at least a month, causing real distress or impairment. The chapter describes a classic triad of symptoms.
That's right. It's like the person is stuck perpetually in that alarm stage. The triad includes 1, intrusion. This means reliving the traumatic event through intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, nightmares.
Awful.
2 is avoidance, trying to avoid anything, people, places, thoughts that reminds them of the trauma. This often leads to emotional numbing, feeling detached, relationship problems, guilt.
And the third?
Hyperarousal, being constantly on edge, increased irritability, difficulty concentrating, jumpiness, an exaggerated startle reflex, always scanning for danger.
What's really striking, pathologically, is the cortisol situation in PTSD. You'd expect sky-high cortisol from chronic stress, but the chapter notes PTSD often involves lower cortisol levels. What's going on there?
It's a bit paradoxical, isn't it? The current thinking is that the system becomes hypersensitive. The cortisol receptors might become more sensitive, or perhaps the negative feedback loop becomes overly efficient, shutting down cortisol production too strongly or too quickly. This dysregulation seems linked to changes in brain areas crucial for fear and memory, like the amygdala and hippocampus. It shows how trauma can actually rewire these circuits.
So if the system is stuck on or is dysregulated like that, how do you treat it? The focus seems heavily on non-drug approaches.
Yes, because often you need to actively retrain the nervous system. The goal of many non-pharmacologic methods is to intentionally engage the parasympathetic nervous system, the rest and digest system, to counteract the chronic sympathetic overdrive.
What are some key ones mentioned?
The source lists 5 main types. First, relaxation techniques, things like progressive muscle relaxation, deep breathing. The aim is to evoke the body's natural relaxation response. Requires practice, quiet space.
Okay.
Second, guided imagery. Using directed thoughts and suggestions to create calming mental scenes, engaging all the senses.
Like imagining a peaceful beach.
Exactly. Third, music therapy. Using music systematically to reduce anxiety, manage pain, even buffer stressful noises in, say, a hospital setting.
Makes sense. What about biofeedback? That sounds more technical.
Biofeedback is fascinating. It uses electronic sensors to give you real-time information about your own physiological states, things you're normally unaware of, like muscle tension via EMG, or skin temperature or conductivity, which reflect autonomic activity. By seeing the feedback, you learn to consciously control those functions.
Learn to relax specific muscles, for example.
Precisely. And fifth, massage therapy. The systematic manipulation of soft tissues. Different techniques like effleurage or petrissage can promote relaxation, relieve muscle tension, and send signals of safety back to the nervous system through touch. #tag outro. So if we pull it all together, this journey through the chapter takes us from that stable baseline of homeostasis through the necessary acute emergency measures of Selye's General Adaptation Syndrome, and unfortunately, sometimes into the damaging consequences of chronic activation, that allostatic load, which we see so clearly in disorders like PTSD.
Right. The message is really clear.
Yeah.
The stress response was built for short bursts of intense physical threat. Applying it constantly to modern, often psychological stressors is fundamentally mismatched and ultimately harmful. And that leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to reflect on. The chapter highlights how individual factors, your age, your health, your mindset, your social support, modify your response. But beyond that, if we know this ancient survival system can get stuck on and cause damage, what responsibility do we have, maybe, to proactively use some of these non-pharmacologic tools, the relaxation, the imagery, the music, to consciously help our bodies turn off a system that's no longer serving its original purpose and might actually be working against our long-term well-being?
Something to think about.
Definitely. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive. We look forward to exploring more source material with you next time.